Gloucestershire, March 1812. It was the settled conviction of the Stroud Valley, a conviction the valley had arrived at without once troubling to climb the hill and look at the thing itself, which is how the soundest valley convictions have always been arrived at, that Nether Fennis Mill was a dead thing, and had been dead these 7 years, and was now fit for nothing better than to have its good stone carted off for somebody's barn. It stood where the little brook called the Wex came down off the wold to join the greater water below, a low grey range of buildings with a broken wheel and a silted race, and a pond head so choked with sedge that a boy could walk dry across it in August, and it had passed. In the estate books of 3 dukes, from the fulling mill at Fennis, in good work to, at last, the old mill, unlettable, it was the particular distinction of Nether Fennis that in 7 years nobody whose opinion was thought to matter had ever once gone inside it. This is worth remembering, because it is the whole of the story that follows. For cloth, like people, is only ever worth the honest weight of it, and no man's cry can add a grain to that, nor his contempt take a grain away. On the 9th of March, in the estate office at Wexcombe Court, with the schedules of the outlying sale open on the table, and his man of business waiting with a pen, Julian Ferrand, 4th Duke of Wexcombe, delivered the judgment that the valley would be repeating, with increasing pleasure, and at his expense, for the better part of a year. A young woman standing near the window, a clothier's daughter, present on her father's business, and asked for her opinion by nobody, had just observed, in a level and unhurried voice, that the mill at Fennis might repay keeping. The Duke did not look up from his papers. "That mill is finished. Let it go," he said to his agent. And then, still without looking up, in the tone a man uses for a window that wants shutting, "And if Miss Merrick has views on broadcloth, Hollis, she may cry them by the yard in her father's shop. I am told that in the cloth trade an opinion will fetch its price, provided it is offered loud enough and near enough to the door." Within the week, Miss Merrick had bought the mill at Fennis, and by the last week of the following March, this is the end of the story, and we shall come round to it in good order, but it is only fair that you should know where the road leads. The Duke of Wexcombe, the most careful and most correct man in 3 parishes, would be sitting in a clothier's counting-house in Stroud, with his hat on his knee, asking the terms of the young woman he had not troubled to look at, and the derelict mill he had dismissed in 6 words would be, by common consent of the same valley that had laughed at her all spring, the soundest cloth works between Stroud and Gloucester, and when his own aunt asked him, with the family directness, what in heaven's name he had meant that day in the estate office, his Grace would discover, to his very great discomfort, that he could not for his life remember what he had meant by it at all. But that is March a 12-month on. This is the March before, and we must begin where she did, which was, as it happened, standing to her boot-tops in the choked pond head of Nether Fennis, an hour before the Duke pronounced it finished. Charlotte Merrick, Lottie to her father, Miss Merrick to the valley, and Merrick's girl to such persons as felt her existence wanted a word of apology, was 26 years old, the only child of Samuel Merrick of Stroud, clothier, a dealer in wool and yarn and finished cloth, whose bill was better paid in Gloucester than most gentlemen's notes. Her mother had died when Lottie was 9. Her father, left with a grave, dark-haired daughter, who asked what things weighed and remembered the answer, did the only sensible thing a busy man could, and put her to use. She had kept his cloth books since 17. She had learned to sort a fleece at 19, until she could throw one into its right grade by the feel of it in the dark. She caught a Painswick spinner's short weight at 21, and she saved her father £140 at 23 by reading a dye-house reckoning more closely than the man who wrote it. She had, besides, a rule her father had taught her the way other fathers teach their daughters to sit a horse. She never let him buy on the pattern alone. Wool, yarn, a finished piece, it was all one. "A pattern is a promise, Lottie," Samuel Merrick liked to say. "The whole piece is the payment. Any man alive can weave you a handsome yard to swear by. Judge no man and no cloth by the pattern. It is necessary to say plainly, because the parlors of the valley said it often and less kindly, what Lottie Merrick was not. She was not a beauty. Though a long way from plain, she had a clear, composed, attending face, and a way of looking at whoever was speaking, as though what they said might be checked, later, against the peace. She was not accomplished, and she was not married, a circumstance the valley attributed to the dye under her nails, and her father to the poverty of the arithmetic that had so far presented itself. She had observed that a clothier's daughter with £9,000 in expectation drew a particular sort of suitor, had priced that sort accurately, and declined to buy. The Merricks had come up to Wexcombe Court that March morning on plain business. The Duke was selling. The third Duke, a large, warm, open-handed man who had loved hospitality and hated accounts in equal measure, had died the autumn before, leaving his son a great name, a beautiful seat, and a quantity of debt that had genuinely startled the lawyers. The fourth Duke was made otherwise. Julian Ferrand was 35, tall, dark, cool-handed, and exact. A man who answered a letter the day it came, and had never in his life been late for anything. And he had set himself, with a kind of grim filial correctness, to pay his father's debts out of his own economy. He had shut the London house and sold his father's hunters, and now he was selling the outlying property of the manor of Feniscombe, a wood, 2 closes, a row of weavers' cottages, and the old mill to men like Samuel Merrick, who had the money because they had spent their lives attending to precisely the things the third Duke had found tedious. Samuel had come to buy the standing timber of Feniswood. Lottie had come to look at it before he bid, and having looked, it was honest beech. She found herself with an hour in hand at the foot of the wood, looking down the little valley at the famous dead mill. She went in at the broken gate. It did not occur to her not to. A fulling mill was a fulling mill, and here was one lying idle, and nobody in 7 years had troubled to walk through it. She was a long time coming out. What Lottie Merrick saw at Nether Fennis that morning, she saw with her boots wet through, and her hem grey with pond mud, which is the only way anybody has ever seen anything true about a mill. She saw, first, that the mill was not dead but stopped, and a stopped thing and a dead thing are as different as a sleeping man and a buried one to anyone who troubles to feel for a pulse. The race was silted, yes, but silt is carded, not conjured, and under it the stone channel ran sound and true, cut deep by some long-dead millwright who had known his fall of water to the inch. The pond head above was choked with sedge, but a pond head is cleared in a fortnight, and the springs that had filled it in the third Duke's grandfather's time were filling it still, quietly, under the weed, wasting down the overflow for want of anyone to set them to work. She stood in the doorway of the fulling house and looked a long time at the stocks, the great oaken hammers that beat the woven cloth soft and thick into true broadcloth, and saw they had been hung wrong, canted off their proper fall by some cheese-paring hand, so that for years this mill had been bruising its cloth where it should have closed it, turning out thin, cockled pieces no honest searcher would seal, and that the fault the valley called the mill's death was not in the mill at all, but in the last man who had been let handle it. And she saw, third, because she made a point of knowing what her own trade was doing, and had sat through every quarter meeting of the Stroud clothiers with her father since she was 20, what the situation of Nether Fennis would be worth within the year. The war was on, and the war wore scarlet. A new brigade was being raised that spring, another spoken of, and the board that clothed the army had let it be known that it would want, before the year turned, a great quantity of superfine scarlet broadcloth, more than the old contracted houses could throw off, tendered by sealed pattern at Gloucester, and sealed piece by the king's searcher. at a price that made a careful clothier's pen shake a little as he set it down. Scarlet is the hardest cloth in England to make sound. It wants the finest long wool, honest fulling, a true fast dye that will not fly nor fade, and above all water, clean, soft, constant water, to full it and scour it and work the dye. And here, wasting itself under the sedge of a choked pond above a sound, deep race, was one of the best small heads of soft water in the valley, at a mill built for fulling, offered that very morning for the price of its stones, because the man who owned it had never once walked up the hill to feel whether it had a pulse. She came out at the broken gate, with her hem ruined and her mind made up, and was in time to stand quietly at the window of the estate office while the men transacted. Her father bought his timber and his wool. Sir Giles Rooke, a neighboring baronet with a laugh like a cart on cobbles, bought the two closes. And then the agent, Mr. Hollis, a decent, tired, honest man of 55, who had served 2 dukes and worried for both, read out the next item on the schedule, the old fulling mill at Fennis, with its close and its pond and its water, valued by Mr. Gattis, the Duke's own mill manager, at £40 for the stone and timber, and recommended for sale at any figure a purchaser could be found to name. There was the sort of laughter that item deserved. Sir Giles Rooke said he would give 30 for it if his grace would send a man to pull it down first. It was at this point, and she was never afterward able to decide whether it had been judgment or simple bookkeeping, the plain discomfort of watching a sound asset, priced as rubble, that Lottie Merrick spoke. "I would not let it go, your grace," she said. "Or not at that figure, and not to be pulled down. The race is silted but sound. The pond head wants only clearing. The springs run yet. The stocks have been hung wrong these 10 years, which is why the mill failed, and not for any fault in the water, and the water is the best small head in the valley for Scarlet. The board will want Scarlet before the year is out, more than the old houses can make, and Scarlet wants exactly this. It is not a finished mill, your grace. It is an unread one." The room was quiet for a moment, in the way a room goes quiet when something has happened outside the order of business. Mr. Hollis looked at the Duke. Sir Giles looked at the ceiling, hugely diverted. Samuel Merrick looked at his own boots, because he knew his daughter, and knew that the only question now remaining was how dearly the next half-minute would be managed. The Duke of Wexcombe had been checking a column of figures, and he finished it before he answered. This was noticed, and repeated for months, and what he said to his agent, as though the window where Miss Merrick stood had been an empty one. The reader has heard it already. It was 6 words about the mill, and a pleasantry about the price of opinions in a cloth shop, and it was delivered without heat, without malice, and without one glance at the young woman whose boots were still gray with the mud of the pond in question, which was, in its way, the completest dismissal a man of his rank had to give, since even contempt is a kind of notice, and he had not paid her so much as that. Lottie curtsied. Nobody could ever afterwards say the curtsy had been anything but correct, and gathered her gloves. "Then the mill is disposed of," she said pleasantly, "to no one in particular. Papa, I shall walk down to Mr. Pardoe's about the timber conveyance. Do not hurry your business on my account." It was 3 miles down the valley to Stroud. She walked it in the better part of an hour, and she spent the first 10 minutes in a temper that made the March hedges swim, and then, being her father's daughter, she stopped walking on the anger, and began walking on the arithmetic, which was better company, and lasted longer. £40 for the stone, the schedule said. She would offer 60, that no man might ever say she had stolen it, and 60 was nothing. She had a little over £300 in her own right, a legacy of her grandmother's, and 8 years of the commissions her father paid her exactly as he would have paid a stranger. Because Samuel Merrick did not hold with unpaid clerks even when he had got them himself. The Scarlet was a risk, but a risk whose materials were her own trade, her father's wool at the door and her own eye at the dye vat, and the water would run whether the valley laughed or not. She had the figures balanced by the time she crossed the Stroud Bridge, and they came out sound both ways, and neither way had the smallest thing to do with the manners of the Duke of Wexcombe. That at least is what she told herself, and Lottie Merrick was a truthful woman in all things but this. Mr. Pardo, attorney of Stroud, had done the Merricks' business for 20 years, and had long since given up being surprised by either of them. But when Miss Merrick, arriving with a ruined him and a perfectly serene countenance, instructed him to wait that same week upon the Duke of Wexcombe's man of business, and offer £60, 20 above the valuation, for the old mill at Fennis, with its close, its pond and all its water rights, the purchase money her own, and the conveyance to her own name, he permitted himself to take off his spectacles. "Your own name, Miss Merrick, not your father's." "My own name, Mr. Pardo. My father has not seen the mill," she considered. "Neither, I think, has the cellar." "You are aware," said Mr. Pardo, who felt somebody in the room ought to say it, "that the whole valley holds that mill to be a ruin." "I am. It is the only opinion the whole valley holds that I have ever been able to buy at £20 above the asking price, and think myself the gainer." She drew off her gloves and sat. "The valuation and 20 over, Miss Pardo, and no haggling. I do not want a bargain struck. I want a deed signed, and the water rights named in it, every spring and every foot of the race, before his Grace's agent has time to walk up the hill and count them." The Duke's man of business, for his part, wanted nothing on earth so much as to be rid of an item that had stood on his schedules like a reproach for 3 years. The order to sell had come down from the estate office that very morning, and so it fell out, with the speed attorneys achieved perhaps twice in a career, that the memorandum of sale was signed, the deposit paid in banknotes from Miss Merrick's own workbag, and the finished, done-for, unlettable mill at Fennis disposed of at £20 above its own valuation by the Friday of that same week, within 4 days, as the valley was shortly to learn with delight, of his Grace's having pronounced sentence upon it, and upon her. When the ink was dry, Lottie folded the memorandum twice, neatly, as she folded everything, and put it in her bag, and it went about with her all that summer, because a woman transacting in a valley that laughed at her found it useful, now and again, to be able to lay the fact upon the table. The valley did laugh. It is only fair to the valley to say that the joke, as first received, was a good one. Merrick's girl, the conscientious one, with the dye under her nails, had been set down by the Duke at his own sale, and had, in what the parlours agreed could only be a fit of wounded female temper, thrown away £60 of her grandmother's money on a ruin full of frogs, to spite him. Sir Giles Rook told it at 11 dinners in a fortnight, and it grew in the telling. By the 8th, Lottie had wept. Mrs. Marchbank of Sencombe House, a rich clothier's widow of 60, who sat at both the valley's tables and missed nothing at either, heard the story twice, ordered her carriage, called on the Merricks in the town on the pretext of matching a grey, drank tea for 50 minutes, with her eyes on Lottie the whole while, and delivered on her way home the first dissenting verdict in the valley. Wept? That girl has never wept over anything smaller than a warehouse fire. Depend upon it, there is something in the mill. As for the Duke, the news of the sale was brought to him by Mr. Hollis that evening. His Grace received it, as he received everything that spring, as one more line in a long ledger of disagreeable necessities. Then the thing is off the books, he said. Sold to a cloth shop, for the price of its stone and something over. Enter it and go on. It is recorded that the Duke then worked a quarter of an hour, laid down his pen, and said to nobody, £20 over the valuation. For a ruin she had walked, and I had not. And then said nothing further the whole evening, which Mr. Hollis, who had known him from a boy, understood to be the sound of a very exact man checking a small sum and not liking the way it came out. Lottie took possession on Lady Day, and Nether Fennis learned for the first time in 7 years what it was to be attended to. She did what she had watched done, and costed done, at every well-run mill her father ever supplied, and what any of the gentlemen who laughed at her might have done any year of the last 7, had they thought a stopped mill worth the climb. She sought out old Reuben Tapp, a master fuller of Fennis Parish, who had run the mill in its last good years, and been turned off, when the Duke's manager put in a cheaper man. She found him at 63 in a cottage garden, eating his heart out, and gave him back his mill. She engaged 6 laborers of Fenniscombe village at the going wage, which made her briefly the most popular purchaser in the parish, the Duke not excepted, and she set them, in the wet of a late Cotswold spring, to clear the pond head and scour the race, to find out what water the mill truly had, and where it wished to go. She was up at Fennis 4 days in the week, which was the valley's second joke at her expense, and the last it enjoyed in comfort. Miss Merrick at the mill in Pattens, standing over the race with a rule while 6 men dug below her, was held to be a spectacle, and 1 or 2 carriages actually slowed on the Fennis lane to carry home a faithful account of it. What the carriages could not see, because it looked like mud, was that the race was answering. Cleared to the soundstone, it drew the pond down clean and delivered its water to the wheel pit in a strong, steady, unbroken fall, and above, where the sedge came out of the pond head in black wet rafts, the springs came up cold and constant in the corner, exactly where old Tapp had promised they would, filling the head faster than the overflow could waste it, water that had been quietly running away for 7 years for want of anyone to shut a hatch and set it to work. "There's your fortune, miss, if you can hold it," said old Tapp, watching the head fill behind the mended hatch. "There is my engine," said Lottie. "It has been running to waste 7 years, and paid no one a farthing. That is finished now." She had the hatch rebuilt, and the overflow set high before May was out, so that the pond stood full to its old mark, and a great head of water lay banked behind the mill against the dry months every clothier in the bottom knew were coming. And because goodwill is the cheapest thing a person of business ever buys, and the dearest to run short of. The first clear water she drew off ran not to her own wheel, but down a new stone channel to the village, where it filled a trough and a wash-house for the women of Fenniscombe, whose own brook ran foul and low every dry summer within living memory. It cost her £9. It was worth, in the reckoning of the parish, a great deal more than the mill had. And when the curate of Fenniscombe gave out from his pulpit a rogation sermon on clean water and the laborer worthy of his hire, and spared nobody's blushes in the doing of it, the Duke of Wexcombe was in his pew at the head of the aisle, and was observed to sit through the passage with the perfect stillness of a man, declining to notice that a sermon has been addressed, and forwarded, and left at his own door. The stocks came next, and old Tapp wept over them, which he would afterward deny. A good millwright out of Stroud rehung the great oaken hammers true to their fall in a week, and when the water was let on, and the wheel took up, and the stocks began at last to rise and drop as they were meant to, the deep, slow, double thump of a fulling mill in true work, a sound the Fennis bottom had not heard in 7 years. Old men came out to the lane end to listen, the way men come out to hear a passing bell reversed and turned into a christening. A fulling mill at work has a heartbeat. You can hear it a half-mile down the water. A patient double knock, the sound of wool becoming cloth. Lottie stood in the fulling house the first morning the stocks ran true, and felt the boards shake under her pattens in time, and old Reuben Tapp, drawing the first true milled piece from the stocks, and spreading it dripping over the horse, ran his cracked old hand down the close, thickened face of it, and took off his hat, which he had not been known to do since the king's last birthday. "Miss," he said, with the solemnity of a man giving evidence at an assize, "I have milled cloth in this valley 50 year, man and boy, and did not think to handle such a piece again before I died." That is sound. It will take the scarlet and hold it, and search true from selvage to selvage. You could clothe a king's own guard in it. They dyed the first scarlet in July, in the little dye-house tap built against the mill, and it is a fact, attested by 6 laborers and a master fuller, and in time by half the valley, that when the first piece came up out of the vat and was spread to the sun on the tenter frame, the whole of Fenniscombe found errands that took it past the mill that afternoon, for the color of it was a wonder. A deep, even, living scarlet that did not fly at the edges nor cloud in the fold, the very color the board would pay a small fortune for, and the old houses were straining to match. And here is the thing that must be set down, because it is the pivot on which the whole honest half of this story turns. A true-made piece of scarlet milled sound and dried honestly, comes off the frame at its right and lawful measure, and stays there, close and firm in the hand, weighing true to the yard, and a cheating piece, milled thin and then strained on the tenter hooks to make up a length its wool was never woven to hold, comes off long and gives in the hand like a lie, and shrinks from the searcher's rule the moment it is wetted, and betrays the man who stretched it. Lottie Merrick had been raised to make the first kind and to know the second at 40 paces, and the difference between them was about to become, though she did not yet know it, the difference between a duke's honor and a duke's ruin. One length of that first true scarlet she never sold. When the county searcher came up from Stroud in July on his rounds, Mr. Yeend, a dry, spare, incorruptible old official whose whole office in the world was to measure cloth against the law and clench his little leaden seal upon the pieces that told the truth, he unrolled her scarlet on the trestle, pulled it, wetted a corner, and measured it twice, and then set his seal on the selvage, and said, which for Mr. Yeend was an oration, "That is honest cloth, Miss Merrick. I have condemned better looking, and sealed worse wearing. Keep your hand as true as that piece, and you'll not see me for an enemy." Lottie kept that piece back, sealed as it was, and folded it twice, neatly, as she folded everything, and laid it in her work-bag on top of the folded deed, and the little lead seal off the first sound piece before it she kept loose in the drawer of her writing-desk, where it did duty as a paperweight all that summer, and if on certain evenings, having balanced the day's books, she turned that small leaden thing over in her fingers rather longer than a paperweight strictly requires, she had at least the satisfaction of knowing that nobody saw her do it. It was the drought that turned the valley's laughter sour in its mouth, and the Duke's superintendent along with it. From the middle of June it did not rain, and it went on not raining, in the hard, bright, cloudless way it does perhaps twice in a generation, until the wold burned brown, and the little brooks of the bottoms sank to a trickle, and then to nothing at all. A fulling mill without water is a barn full of silent hammers, and one after another. Through July and August, the mills of the Stroud bottom stood still, their cloth lying half-milled and spoiling on the horses, while the clothiers reckoned what a stopped mill costs a man in the middle of a war. Sir Giles Rook's own little mill stood still within the fortnight, and he swore about it at 11 dinners. But at Fennis, above the empty brook, lay a great banked head of soft water that a clothier's daughter had ponded in May against exactly this, and the wheel at Fennis turned, and the stocks at Fennis fell, patient and double and slow, all through the burning weeks when every other wheel in the valley hung dead, the one live heartbeat in a bottom gone silent. And Lottie Merrick milled sound scarlet by the piece, while better men than the Duke of Wexcombe took her, for the first time, entirely seriously. Now the Duke of Wexcombe held, through his own working mill lower down the water, and the man who managed it, a standing contract with the board for Army Scarlet. It had come to his father before him, and he valued it because it was the one piece of his inheritance that had never given him cause to blush. A ferent had clothed the king's men, off and on, for 60 years. His mill was larger than Fennis, and better placed on the water, and honestly managed it would have weathered even that summer with credit. But it was not honestly managed. Mr. Gaddis, the same cheese-paring man who had hung the Fennis stocks wrong 10 years before and been kept on for the cheapness of him, had been running the Duke's mill for his own pocket 3 years, buying short wool and charging for long, selling the manor's good clip cheap to a Bristol jobber, and skimping the fulling to save water and time. And now, with the drought throttling his wheel, and the delivery falling due, and 3 years of skimped work leaving him a great yardage short, Mr. Gaddis did the thing thin men in a corner have done since cloth was first sold by the yard. He strained. He had his half-milled, dishonest Scarlet racked out on the tenterhooks and stretched a nail, and a nail again, until it made up on the frame the length his wool had never been woven to hold, and he dried it hard, folded it fair, and sent it down under the Duke's own name to be searched and sealed and delivered to the king. Mr. Yeend the searcher unrolled the first piece of it on the trestle at the Stroud cloth hall, and pulled it, and wetted the corner, and it gave in his hand, and shrank from his rule, and told him in 3 motions the whole history of the cheat. He measured 6 pieces, and condemned all 6. He did not seal 1 thread of it. And because the searcher's office is the same for a duke as for a jobber, that being rather the point of it, he entered the condemnation fair in the hall book, where any man might read it, and sent formal word up to Wexcombe Court that the Duke's Scarlet was strained, short and false, that it could not be sealed, that it could not lawfully be delivered, and that his grace stood at that moment in default of his contract with the board, a fortnight from the delivery day, in a drought that had stopped his wheel. With his honor and 60 years of his family's good name racked out on the tenterhooks beside the cloth. It was Mr. Hollis who brought the news up to the court, and Mr. Pruitt, the Duke's old superintendent of works, who understood it, and it is from Mr. Pruitt, a slow, honest, cloth-bred old man, kept as far from Gaddis's books as Gaddis could contrive, that we have the account of how the Duke took it. His Grace read the searcher's letter through twice, set it down, and asked one question, in the level administrative voice he kept for the moments that mattered most. "Is it true?" And when Mr. Pruitt, who had ridden down to the hall and pulled the cloth through his own hands, said that it was true, every word, and that he was ashamed to his boots, the Duke was quiet a moment, and then said only, "Then we do not deliver false cloth to the king's men under my name, whatever it costs. Find me sound Scarlet, Pruitt, before the delivery day, or find me the forfeit, and I will pay it and hold my tongue." And Mr. Pruitt, going out, reflected that, in all the wreck of that hour, his Grace had not once asked to have the cheat hushed, which was more than he would have wagered on any other gentleman in the county, and reflected, further, that there was sound sealed Scarlet in the valley that fortnight, at a mill his Grace had called finished, in the hands of a young woman his Grace had told to cry her opinions by the yard. Mr. Pruitt rode up to Fennis the next morning, unasked and unsent, on his own honest responsibility, because he had spent 40 years watching cloth tell the truth about the men who made it, and could not now unlearn the habit, and he came home and did a thing he had never done in either Duke's service. He wrote out, plainly, a full memorandum of what the drought had stopped, and what it had not, of whose wheel in the valley still turned, and whose cloth still sealed, and of the exact quantity of sound, searched sealed Scarlet standing ready at the mill at Fennis, that could, if his Grace could bring himself to buy it, be delivered to the board under the contract, and save the whole, and he laid it on the Duke's table with the morning letters, where it could not be missed, and could not be argued with. The Duke read it. He read everything. It was his virtue, and this once it was very near his salvation. What he said to Mr. Pruitt, when the old man came in at noon, was, "You had better have the gig put to." And when Mr. Pruitt, not certain he had heard, asked where his Grace would be driven, the Duke said, looking out of the window at the brown burned park, and not at his superintendent, to Fennis, It appears I am to buy Scarlet from a mill I called finished, of a woman I told to keep to her shop. I had rather do it in person than by a letter I should be ashamed to sign. Have the gig put to Pruitt, and do not, on your life, look pleased about it. He found the proprietor of Nether Fennis at the tenter frames in the close, in a dye-stained apron, turning a length of drying scarlet against the sun, and whatever opening the drive down the valley had furnished him with, the sight of the mill took clean away. It was not that it had become handsome, it was that everything in view was reasoned. The pond stood full behind its mended hatch when every other head in the bottom was dry. The race ran strong and clean where the brook below was a string of puddles. The stalks fell patient and true. The scarlet on the frames was the color the board dreamed of, and the whole of it hung together like a well-kept set of books that came out right at the foot of every column. The Duke had spent a year learning his father's estate out of ledgers, and he was, whatever else may be said of him, a man who knew sound administration when it was laid before him at mill scale. He stood at the close gate a moment longer than a man stands who is only deciding what to say. Then he came in, and the 6 laborers of Fenniscombe discovered pressing business at the far end of the close, in the manner of laborers everywhere when weather of a certain kind is coming on. Miss Merrick. Your Grace. The curtsy was, once again, correct. If he had come expecting anything else, confusion or triumph, or the small feminine revenges, it was not offered him. She stood with the wet scarlet over her arm and the level attending look he remembered from the window of the estate office, and she waited, exactly as a person waits who has all the day's work before her, and none of it to spare. And she made him say it. He said it well. That must be granted him. He had rehearsed nothing, which for a man of his habits was itself an event. But the sentences came out in his usual order, dry and swept clean. His scarlet under the board contract had been found short and false. He would not deliver false cloth to the king's men under his name. He was told, he did not say by whom, but he did not pretend it was, other than it was, that there stood at Fennis a quantity of sound scarlet, milled and searched and sealed honestly through the whole of the drought. He would be obliged if she would name her terms for as much of it as she could spare against the delivery day, and, this with the smallest pause, no longer than a pen takes in the lifting, he understood the searcher had sealed her cloth without a mark against it, which was more, he would say plainly, than could be said that week for the Duke of Wexcombe's. The searcher sealed it, your Grace. Mr. Yeen seals what is true and condemns what is not, and he does not know a duke from a jobber at the trestle, which is the whole use of him. She laid the wet scarlet over the frame, drew off her glove, took from the rail a folded piece already dried and sealed, and put it into his hands, and this, though neither of them remarked it then or ever, was the first thing that had passed directly between their 2 hands, ungloved, in the warm reek of the dye-house, with 6 laborers not watching. Pull it, your Grace. Wet the corner, if you please, and pull it against the rule there. My cloth does not mind being doubted. It answers for itself. He pulled it. It held. It did not give in his hand nor shrink from the rule. It lay close and firm and full, and told him the truth in his own 2 hands the way it had told the searcher, and something crossed his face that was too brief to be called an expression. The flicker of a man hearing an argument close, and Lottie named her price, the fair board price, less nothing for his necessity, because she did not choose to be the sort of seller who charged a man double for the accident of his need, and no more than the fair price either, though she might have had double, and he would have paid it. Because she meant to sell Scarlet for 30 years, and thought a duke's future custom worth more than a single hard bargain in a bad month. It was a fair price, set a shade under what a hard woman could have taken, and they both knew both of those things before she had finished speaking, and each of them knew that the other knew. You might have asked far more, said the Duke, when the sound cloth was counted and the thing was as good as done, and his voice was not quite the voice he had used at the estate office in March. "I might have asked more the once," said Lottie. "I mean to sell Scarlet a long while, your grace, and to your house after you. Your successor's custom is worth more to me than your bad quarter-hour." And then, because the sentence had come out with one clause more than she had strictly audited, she added, composedly, "I mean the quarter-hour of being cheated by your own manager, your grace, and finding it out on the delivery day. A man should not have to buy honesty at a ruinous price merely because the honesty in his own mill has gone bad. He should be able to buy it fair. Over the next hedge." "No," said the Duke, after a moment, looking down the reasoned mill, at the full pond behind the mended hatch and the one live wheel in a dead valley. "He should not. I begin to think, Miss Merrick, that there is a general principle in it." He did not say what the principle was. He got up into the gig at the close gate, the sound Scarlet stowed behind him that would save his name with the board. And it was noticed in the village, where all his goings and comings were noticed, that his grace drove the first mile down the Fennis lane at a walk, with the reins loose and his eyes on the middle distance, like a man carrying home a long sum, and being very careful not to spill it. After that August there grew up between Wexcombe Court and the mill at Fennis a commerce the valley watched the way it watched the weather-glass. Mr. Pruitt rode over weekly about the Scarlet and stayed, more weeks than not, a half-hour past the business of it, because Miss Merrick asked him the sort of questions nobody had asked him in 40 years. How the manor clip had been sorted in the old Duke's time, where the good long wool lay in the county, which of the turned-off fullers could be trusted with a fine warp, and wrote his answers in a book, and the old superintendent, who had spent his life being talked over, found himself at 60 being heard, and went over, there is no gentler word for it, entirely to her side of the water, while remaining perfectly loyal to his master, a feat of double book keeping that only stewards and mothers ever bring off. And Mr. Gaddis, whose strained Scarlet lay condemned in the hall book for any man to read, and whose 3 years of cooked accounts were beginning, very slightly, to steam in the warmth of his master's new attention, took note that the wind had changed, and set himself to find some direction to turn it that was not toward his own door. The saving of the man had a season yet to run, and the wheel turned in October at Gloucester, on the day the board opened the sealed tenders for the great new Scarlet contract, the largest cloth order the county had seen in a generation, for the clothing of 2 whole new regiments, at a price that would make the house that won it for a decade. The old contracted clothiers had tendered, Sir Giles Rooke had put in on cloth not his own, the Duke of Wexcombe's mill had tendered, though under a cloud, Gaddis having patched up a pattern fair enough to seal even while his bulk cloth was condemned. And among the patterns laid before the board that morning, entered in her own name, Charlotte Merrick of Nether Fennis Mill, was a folded length of the truest Scarlet in the county, milled through a drought that had stopped every rival wheel, and sealed already by the king's own searcher, without one mark against it. The board pulled the patterns, and wetted and measured them, and did with each exactly what Mr. Yean did at his trestle, and when they had done, they awarded the great contract, whole and undivided, to the pattern that held its measure wet and dry, and searched true from selvage to selvage, and that pattern was the one entered in the name of a clothier's daughter from a mill a duke had called finished. The clerk read the award in the flat voice clerks keep for other men's fortunes, the scarlet clothing of the 2 new regiments, to Miss Charlotte Merrick, of Fennis, in the county of Gloucester. Every clothier could do the sum in the time it took to hear it, and the room looked, with one accord and no kindness, at nothing at all, in the exact manner of a county understanding all at once that the best joke of the year had been on the men who told it. And the story was over every dinner table by Sunday, no longer the comedy of Merrick's girl and her frog pond, but in its second and far more durable form, the form that stings. Wexcombe called the mill finished and sold it for the price of its stone to a girl he told to keep to her shop, and she milled the truest scarlet in the county out of it. Saved his contract when his own cloth was condemned for a cheat, and took the king's own order out from under him at Gloucester, and drove home and said not one word about any of it. It is one thing to be laughed at for a bad bargain. It is another, and a far worse one, to a man of the fourth Duke's composition, to be shown up in open hall as the master of a cheat. He sat through the rest of the board's business with the sensation, wholly new to him, of a man who feels a single thread give in a coat he had believed sound, and begins to understand that the whole garment is strained. For if his scarlet had been false these 3 years, the question was no longer what Miss Merrick had made at Fennis, but what else had been made false in his name, while he believed himself the careful one. And below that, a worse question yet, why a clothier's daughter with the dye still on her hands had sold him soundcloth at a fair price to save the honor of a man who had set her down in front of witnesses, and what precisely it was that he had said to her in return. He went home and sent for Gaddis's books, the whole 3 years of them, and sat with them alone until 2 in the morning, and the next day he did the wrong thing, as even careful men will when the sting is fresh, and it is to the great credit of the story that he did it, because it was the making of all that came after. He did not, that first raw day, suspect his own manager. That was the very habit of trust in his own administration that had ruined him, and it does not break in a night. He suspected the woman who had shown him up. Gaddis, scenting at last the direction he had been looking for, helped him to it, with the poisonous, respectful, entirely factual art of the cornered underling begging leave to observe that Miss Merrick's scarlet had sealed with a very convenient ease, that the searcher, Mr. Yend, was Fenniscombe born, and had known the Merricks these 20 years, and that it was a strange thing, was it not, your grace, that a mill 3 months out of a 7-year ruin should have carried off, over houses 50 years established, the greatest contract in the county, as though honesty could be conjured out of a frog pond in a single dry summer. It was untrue in everything but its facts, which is the most serviceable kind of untruth there is. And the Duke, this must be set down plainly, because his biographer in these pages has grown fond of him. And fondness is no license for a false account. The Duke gave it harbor. Not belief, harbor. It offered him the one thing he had wanted since October, a version of the summer in which he had not been careless and cheated in his own mill, but merely outmaneuvered by a sharper trade, a version in which the clothier's daughter had not made truer cloth than his, but had merely known the searcher and cut her pattern clever. A careful man shown up in open hall will pay almost any price for such a version, and the price the Duke paid was this. On a grey morning in November, when Miss Merrick came down to the Stroud counting-house that was now half hers to settle a scarlet delivery, his grace had her shown, not to the outer office where the trade was done, but to the inner counting-room. And he stood at the table with Gaddis's insinuations squared in his mind if not on paper, and after the civilities, which were exact, he said in the level administrative voice in which he had once disposed of a mill, because it was still, God help him, the only voice he had been taught for the moments that counted, before the schedule. Miss Merrick, a question of business. Your winning pattern at Gloucester sealed with an ease that has been remarked to me. The searcher is your neighbor and your father's old acquaintance. I should be glad to know whether the cloth you delivered to the board is, in truth and in the bulk, the equal of the pattern you sealed, or whether a pattern was made fine, and a friend at the trestle did the rest. There was a silence of the particular kind that Lottie Merrick had spent her whole grown life being too sensible to make, and then she did not make it any longer. She set her folder of schedules on the table, unhurried, and she opened her workbag, and she laid out upon the counting-room table, in a row, squaring each item with a single fingertip as she set it down, the receipts. The searcher's own sealed certificate of the winning bulk, entered and copied fair from the hall book, Mr. Yeen's hand and the board's clerk's beneath it. Her sorter's book, showing every fleece of the wool that went into the contract, graded and weighed at the loft door, in her own hand and old taps. A length cut from the very bulk of the delivered cloth, sealed, laid beside the sealed pattern. A match to the thread for any man with eyes and a rule to see. And last, folded twice as she folded everything, the first true piece of the summer, the one Mr. Yeen had sealed in July, and she had never sold, with his words to her written on a slip and pinned to its selvage. "Pull them, your grace," she said. "Wet the corners, and measure the pattern against the bulk. You have a rule at your elbow, and I will hold the other end." The searcher sealed my cloth, because it was true, and he would have condemned it as fast as he condemned yours, had it lied to his rule. That is the whole use of a searcher, and why it does not signify a farthing where he was born. You ask whether I cut a fine pattern and cheated the bulk. That is the very thing your own mill did this summer, under your own name, to the king's own men, and it was found out at the trestle in a morning. Because cheating cloth always is. It is the one thing in this trade that cannot be hidden, which is why thieves come to grief in it. I did not outconjure you at Gloucester. I outmade you. Every thread I sealed was milled sound in plain daylight by men whose names are in that book. And it is on the king's men's backs this minute, keeping the rain off, and it will still be sound cloth when this conversation is a thing we are both ashamed of. She gathered nothing up. She left the row squared on the table, which was its own sentence. If that is sharp practice, your grace, then sharp practice is only another word for keeping your hand true and your book straight. And every man in this valley is free to take it up. The materials are a fleece, a fair rule, and the nerve to be measured. She took up the folder of schedules again, and her voice did not change at all, which was the terrible thing about it, as his grace's aunt would afterward observe with relish. It stayed level and pleasant and final, like a hatch coming down on well-greased runners. The Scarlet you have contracted for will be delivered on the days named. My contracts take no offense, whatever I may. But I am not at leisure to widen our dealings further, and I will tell you why, since you are owed a plain answer. It is not the suspicion. Suspicion is weather, and I have worked in worse. It is that you did not walk your mill before you sold it, nor pull your own cloth before you signed for it, nor read your own manager's books before you believed him against me. You are the most careful man in this county, your grace, everywhere but where the looking would cost you the trouble of doubting your own house. And I have been the honest woman in one careless man's mill this summer already, and mended his name at a fair price, and I have no ambition to be the thief in it as well. Good morning." The curtsy, for the third time in this history, was correct. Then she was gone, and the Duke of Wexcombe stood alone in the counting-room with a row of sealed cloth and copied certificates squared on the table like a hand laid down face up, and his manager's clever insinuation curling somewhere in his mind, already going the color of a thing that has been believed too long in the dark and brought out at last into the day. There are men who so answered, summon their dignity, which is to say their servants, and have the cloth carried out and the matter closed. What the fourth Duke did instead was the thing that saved him, and it is the reason this story consents to end as it does. He pulled every piece in the row himself, wet and dry, and measured the pattern against the bulk with his own rule, until his own hands told him what the searchers had. And then he sent, not for his dignity, but for Mr. Pruitt, and for the whole of Gaddis's books for 3 years, and the manor clip accounts back to his father's day. For 11 days, while the contracted Scarlet came down from Fennis and was signed for by a superintendent who found the Duke's own handwriting suddenly all through the delivery book, His Grace conducted upon his own mill the audit he had been so ready to conduct upon a woman who owed him nothing. He walked the mill, weighing half-milled cloth in the fulling house, matching at the wool loft what Gaddis had charged for long wool against what the sorter swore had come in short, reckoning on the tenter ground at dusk how many nails of false length 3 years of straining had racked into cloth sold under his name. And the books came up short against the truth the way Gaddis's cloth came up short against the rule. At the end of the 11 days the Duke sat one long evening with the whole of it ruled into 2 columns in his own exact hand, and the columns said what columns say, without manners and without mercy, that the cheat had never been at Fennis. Fennis was only the one mill in the valley where his own cloth had at last been set beside honest cloth, and made to answer for the difference. The wrought was his own, and the one person in the county who had made true cloth, and sold it to him fair, and told him so to his face had been repaid, for her honesty, with an accusation of the precise crime his own manager was that moment being convicted of in the Duke's own hand. Mr. Gaddis's management was ended by the next morning, with a reckoning exact to the shilling of what he had cost the estate, and a plain intimation that a prosecution for the strained cloth waited only upon his Grace's pleasure, and the manager, who could count as well as the next thin man, took his character and his silence, and was gone out of the valley within the week. And on the evening after that, at Sencombe House, where he had dined perhaps twice a year out of duty since his succession, the Duke of Wexcombe sat long over the walnuts with Mrs. Marchbank, who had contrived the invitation within an hour of hearing about the counting-room. Her methods, as has been said, were never explained and never needed to be, and who mercifully waited until the servants were gone before she began. "Well, Duke, you have turned off the man who told you what you wished to hear, which is the first sensible extravagance of your reign. Now what do you propose to do about the woman who told you what you did not? I imagine, Mrs. Marchbank, that you have the answer drawn. I have had it drawn since May, but you could not have signed it then. You were still proud. Not the strutting kind. The worse kind, that files itself under prudence. You have been told the whole of your life that you are the careful one, the correct one, the son who pays what the father spent, and you have taken such comfort in being right about the small things, Julian, that you never once thought to pull the cloth and see whether you were right about the large ones. That girl has never yet told you a thing you wish to hear. Do you know how rare that is to a man of your rank? Men of your rank pay fortunes for looking-glasses. You were handed a true rule, free, at your own estate sale, and you told it to keep to its shop. She cracked a walnut herself and leveled the pick at him in a manner his aunt would have recognized across 2 counties. I was born to the gentry and married into the cloth, and I have watched this valley weigh itself 40 years, and I will tell you the whole of what I know. There are 2 kinds of match, the kind where each has bought the other's pattern, and the kind where each has pulled the other's bulk. The first wears well for about 4 years. Now, she will not come to you. She has walked out on you once, and she is the walking out kind, which, you may thank Providence on your knees, is the only kind worth the following. And you cannot buy her back. She has answered your one insult already with a row of sealed cloth left squared upon the table. So there is nothing left you but the one piece of business you have never transacted with any living soul, to go down to her counting-house, on her ground, with no rank in your voice and no settlement in your pocket, and be measured, and treat. The Duke was quiet a long moment, turning his glass by the stem. With the look, she recorded it with satisfaction for 30 years. Of a man pulling the last figure of a long sum and finding, this time, that it held. "You are mistaken in one particular, Mrs. Marchbank," he said at last. "I did notice, In March, at the estate office, when she gave me the 3 reasons and never raised her voice. I noticed, and it was inconvenient, and I filed it. That is what I have instead of blindness, madam, a filing system. It is a worse fault. A blind man cannot help what he fails to see. No, said Mrs. Marchbank comfortably, but a filing man can go back and reopen the drawer. Go home, Julian. The Scarlet contract runs 3 years, and will want an honest mill behind it every day of them, and you have wool to sell her, and fulling to buy of her, and a name to remake with her, and every last one of your excuses is, I am delighted to say, entirely commercial. He came to the Stroud counting house in December, on a plain trade errand that he had, for the first time in his life, arranged to have no other business behind, and he was kept waiting 20 minutes in the small inner room where the Merricks transacted, under a framed chart of the county's mills, and a shelf of stoppered sample jars. Wool and oil and madder and cochineal in their rows, with his hat on his knee, while a spinner's reckoning was finished beyond the door, because Lottie Merrick was not a woman who would abridge one man's business for another man's rank. What he thought while he waited he never afterward told anybody, but when Lottie came in at last, with the die on her fingers and the spinner's account still in her hand, he stood, and did not begin with the weather. Miss Merrick, in March, at my estate office, you offered me, unasked and for nothing, the 3 soundest sentences ever spoken about a mill of mine, and I told you to cry them by the yard in a shop. In August you sold me truth at a fair price, when a hard woman might have had my honor at auction, and saved my name with the board, and I have never yet thanked you for it, an omission I am here in part to mend. And in November I did the worst thing of the 3 I asked you, on a thief's whisper, whether your honesty was a conjuring trick. And you answered with a row of sealed cloth and left it squared, and were good enough not to throw me into the street, which I had earned. I am not come to apologize, or not only. An apology is a coin a gentleman may mint at his own pleasure, and you have taught me a proper suspicion of any payment that costs the payer nothing. I am come to be measured, and to treat. I want to buy your fulling for my own mill's cloth, at what your stocks and water are worth, and not at what my drought made me desperate to pay. I want to sell you the manor's long wool, honestly sorted and honestly weighed this time, for I have walked my own wool loft now, in my shirt sleeves, with a book. I want an agreement between our 2 mills to run the length of the Scarlet contract and beyond it, that survives my temper and yours, though I am reliably informed only one of us is troubled with the article. And, this with the smallest pause, no longer than a rule takes in the turning, I am instructed by my aunt and by Mrs. Marchbank, and by a conviction that arrived, as all my convictions do, some months after the invoice, that I am to say the whole of it plainly, and on your ground. And this is your ground, so I will add the last item to the schedule, and you may strike it out without prejudice to the rest. I do not want the mill at Fennis back. I want its maker. Not rescued. You are the least rescuable person in this county. Not raised up. God knows you would audit the elevation and find it short. Wanted. As a man wants the one partner in the trade, whose bulk is always the equal of her pattern, when his own has just been proved, in his own hand, to be false, and if that is not a lover's language, it is at least the only language in which I have never once managed to tell a lie. There was a silence in the small counting room, and it is recorded that Miss Charlotte Merrick, who had answered a duke's insult inside a week, and a duke's insinuation inside 2 minutes, looked at the last item on this schedule a long moment, and then said, in a voice her father through the wall did not recognize, being softer than the voice she priced wool in, "You will understand, your grace, that I do not seal upon a first pulling." And then, the composure coming back like water finding its old mark behind the hatch, the fulling, and the wool, and the agreement between the mills we may draw fair today. Mr. Pardo is at the Swan, and can be fetched by 4. The last item stands over. It is not condemned, sir. It is under the searcher's hand, and the searcher does not hurry, and you will call again, if you please, when there is no other business whatever on the table between us. None at all, so that neither of us may ever pretend afterward that the accounts were mixed. That, said the Duke of Wexcombe, is the first ruling you have handed down this year that has fallen in my favor. And he stayed, and drew the agreements fair with Mr. Pardoe by candlelight, and the Merrick's clerk dined out on the story of that evening for 11 years. The public reckoning. For in a valley, everything must be reckoned publicly sooner or later, or it does not count. Came in January at the Stroud Cloth Hall on the searching day before the assembled clothiers of the county. There was a question of the trust of the hall, and a place on the searching committee fallen vacant, and old sores about the great contract still rankling, and Sir Giles Rooke, who owed somebody something for a winter of being laughed at over a stopped mill and a borrowed pattern, was heard to wonder aloud, in the pause between businesses, whether the hall ought in prudence to weigh too heavily the opinions of a mill not 12 months old, gentlemen, and, I mean nothing by it, under petticoat management, whatever the searcher may have been persuaded to seal. It was the Duke of Wexcombe who rose. He rose in the deliberate way he did everything, and the hall went quiet, because the county had waited 5 months to hear what his grace would find to say on the whole business, and the county knew the settling of an account when it saw one get to its feet. The hall has heard Sir Giles, he said. I have a declaration to make, and I will make the whole of it, because it has been making itself in my books all winter, and I had rather speak it than have it whispered. In March last I owned the mill at Fennis, and I called it finished in the hearing of the lady who then bought it, and I sold it to her for the price of its stone, and told her to keep her judgment for her father's shop. The valley has enjoyed the comparison ever since. This summer my own Scarlet, made in my own mill under my own name, was pulled at that trestle by Mr. Yeaned and condemned, strained, short and false, and could not be sealed, nor delivered, and was no better than a cheat upon the king's men. And I have since walked my own mill, and audited my own manager, and found in my own hand that the cheat was 3 years old, and mine to answer for, and I have turned the man off, and will make the board whole to the last yard. Miss Merrick's cloth, in the same drought, at the same trestle, was sealed without a mark 6 times over, and when my contract stood in default, she sold me sound Scarlet at a fair price to save my name, which she was under no obligation to do, and I repaid her with a suspicion I am ashamed to have entertained. There is no petticoat management at Fennis, gentlemen, there is management. I have examined it, at my own cost and to my own shame, and I will tell this hall what I have had occasion to learn this year. Whoever taught this valley to laugh at a mill it had not walked, and at cloth it had not pulled, taught it at my expense. The lesson is paid for in full, out of my own pocket and my own pride, and the hall may have the benefit of it for nothing, which is a better price than I got. The hall gave Fennis its place on the committee without a division, and the county, which never apologizes, did the thing counties do instead, and began that same evening to remember that it had always said there was something remarkable in Merrick's girl, and Mrs. Marchbank, driving home from the hall, remarked to her coachman. She had reached the time of life for remarking things to her coachman, that she had watched a great many gentlemen stand up in that hall in 40 years and give away money, but only the one stand up and give away the joke against himself, and that the valley would find, on reflection, that the second was much the rarer coin, and her coachman, who had held her horses through 40 years of the valley's reflections, said no doubt her ladyship knew best, and the horses agreed. He called again in March, a 12-month to the month from the day he had called the mill finished. When there was no business on the table, she had seen to it that there was none, having closed the quarter 2 days early, which was the only public sign she ever gave. He came up the Fennis Lane on foot this time, in the soft evening, and found her at the pond head above the mill, where the great banked water lay bright and full and constant behind the mended hatch, and the wheel turned patient below, and the stocks fell double and slow in the fulling house, the heartbeat of the whole reasoned place. And what passed there was brief, because the essential negotiation had been conducted all year in scarlet and schedules, and one row of squared sealed cloth, and both parties came, as Lottie observed, current in their accounts. "I am given to understand," said the Duke, "that you do not take terms from dukes." "That has been my policy," Lottie agreed. "It has served me tolerably, on the whole. Then I have not brought terms." He stood on the far side of the full pond head, hat in hand, precisely where the springs came up cold and constant that had run to waste for 7 unread years. "I have brought a proposal of merger. The style of the two houses to be Ferrand and Merrick, or Merrick and Ferrand as the parties shall agree. The parties to keep separate books and to pull one another's cloth without notice and without offense, forever, the mill at Fennis to remain, in law and in fact, entirely and only yours. Because I have learned at last what it cost me not to know which things in this world are not for sale. Your father to dine at Wexcombe every Sunday of his life, and to bring his rule. And the whole arrangement to run, he considered, as a careful man does before he commits himself to a term of years, in perpetuity, renewable hourly. I am instructed by my aunt that I am also to mention love. I had intended to. It is the whole of the consideration, Miss Merrick. There is nothing else in the instrument. I have pulled it twice and measured it, and it holds." And Charlotte Merrick, who had walked the ground of every bargain she ever made, and pulled the cloth of every one, looked at him a moment across the bright constant water, with the level attending look he had once declined to meet, and found that, for the first time in her grown life, she had already walked this bargain, all year, in patents, and knew exactly what lay under it and what it weighed. "Then we are agreed in principle, your grace," she said composedly, and gave him her hand across the hatch, die and all. And what she added, when he had come round the pond head by the stones, and there was no water between them at all, the 6 labourers of Fenniscombe, who to a man happened just then to be looking the other way, have unanimously declined for 40 years to report. They were married in June, at Fenniscombe Church, a year and a quarter from the March morning he had called her mill finished, and Sir Giles Rooke danced at the wedding, because counties are like that, and Mrs. Marchbank cried, which she denied, and Mr. Pruitt gave the bride's health in a speech of 4 sentences he had plainly written and rewritten for a week. And Samuel Merrick, asked by a Bristol cousin whether it were not a great match for a clothier's daughter, answered comfortably that he could not speak for the heralds, but that as a man of business he would say the Duke had bought at the top of the market and would never see the price again, and drank to it. The mill kept its name. She would never have it changed, and in time the name changed its own meaning, as names do when the facts beneath them are set right, until Fennis Scarlet meant, from Stroud to Gloucester and wherever the 2 new regiments carried it, the cloth that held its measure wet and dry, and searched true from selvage to selvage, and the mill whose wheel had turned through the great drought, and the soft constant water at the head of the Wex. The Duchess of Wexcombe kept her own books to the end of her life, and the dye under her nails scandalized 3 generations of dinner tables, and her husband, who had once told her to cry her opinions by the yard, was heard at those same tables, whenever a scheme or a bargain or a fine sounding pattern was laid before him, to ask first, always. In the family voice his children learned to imitate lovingly behind his back. But has it been weighed? 2 objects outlasted the principals, and are the proper end of this story. In the shallow drawer of her writing desk, folded twice, neat as she folded everything, lay the first true length of Fennis Scarlet, with Mr. Yeen's little lead seal clenched on its selvage, and his words to her pinned to the back of it, that he had condemned better looking and sealed worse wearing, and would not see her for an enemy. And on the library mantel at Wexcombe Court, between the porcelain and in some defiance of it, lay a single small disc of grey lead. The first searcher's seal struck on the first sound piece she ever milled at Fennis, set there by the Duke himself, who was exact about everything, including this, and when guests asked, and guests always asked, he would take it up and turn it once in his fingers, so that the little stamped mark upon it read true, and give them the saying the valley had long since worn smooth, and that you may have now for nothing, as she once gave him the 3 sentences at the window. That cloth, like people, is only ever worth the honest weight of it, and no man's cry can add a grain to that, nor his contempt take a grain away. Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.